Good day, and welcome to Announcements Weekly Wraps. I'm Vav Govender, and as usual, what we'll do is we'll start off some general market news and end up with a tech segment at the end. In our general market news, we're going to cover the following. Obviously, with less than a week to go to the US election, we're going to cover that. Then China's latest stimulus. And then we're going to end up looking at some economic numbers that come to the US, including inflation, jobs, as well as GDP growth. And in our tech segment, there's been a lot of earnings releases this week. We look at some of those, but we're going to focus more deeply on Alphabet and its dispute with the US government around possible monopoly practices. So let's just look at first the US elections. As I speak to you, we have about 5 days to go to the election. I don't think that there's been any news in the last 5 days that is going to be spectacularly important. There has been gaffes on both sides. There was a comedian at Trump's MSG, Madison Square Garden, event, who used some really incendiary words. He basically, if you want to learn some of this, just don't hire an insult comic to do a political event. He's going to insult somebody that's going to get offended. Then, for some reason, Joe Biden came out the day after and kind of reversed the gains the Democrats had made by using having another gaffe where he basically insulted all Trump supporters as garbage people. And so it kind of took up some of the advantage that the Democrats had from the initial event. To give you an idea of how important that initial insult that the comic had been, we saw a number of important Puerto Ricans. By the way, the insult was against Puerto Rico, and he called it a floating island of garbage. The garbage meme was quite strong this week, and we saw Bad Bunny, which is a famous musician, like 40-something million people that follow him on social media, J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez, Ricky Martin, the guy that wrote Shebang and stuff, come out, as well as some other famous Puerto Ricans, the number of Puerto Ricans in the US, and basically came out and said, this is an insult against Puerto Rico, and then we must, fight against this. It could be significant. There, I think 3% of people in Pennsylvania, or voters in Pennsylvania, have some kind of Puerto Rican descent that might, impact that. Then the subsequent, event with Biden, where he basically used the same word garbage to refer to Trump supporters, and this calls back to the deplorables, insult that Hillary Clinton used against Trump supporters in her loss in 2016. Kind of reversed the initial advantage they had, and in fact, Trump took advantage of this kind of reversal by doing an event where he basically drove a garbage truck. Strangely enough, and actually did a speech at one of his events thereafter, where he basically wore the garbage truck kind of outfit uniform. Yes, it makes a lot of news, but I don't think either of these things was significantly important to the outcome of the election. I do, however, think that just looking at some of the trends so far, here's what we are seeing. Firstly, Trump or the Republicans have gotten a lot more success with the early voting. They even are, beating the Democrats in some states that they're not going to win at the moment, versus New Jersey. They have a higher turnout in terms of early votes, at least at the time I last checked, the Democrats, even though New Jersey is a very strong Democratic state and there's no chance that Trump is going to win it. They are doing very well in places like Nevada. It probably is doing similar kind of numbers in most of the states that they have early voting in. It's not a guarantee that this is going to translate over to a win on Tuesday, because what happens is that if you're voting anyway, if you vote early, vote late, doesn't really matter. However, what it does do is it allows the campaigns to focus on the people that have not voted yet, and kind of notch off those that have voted, off their list, which might make them more efficient. Also, sometimes people just don't get to the polls. Whatever happens on the day, they may just, for whatever reason, not get there. And in that scenario, you'd rather have the vote already counted for you through early voting than basically have to rely on somebody coming to you on election day. But that being said, it does seem that we are seeing a bit more enthusiasm for the Trump campaign. The polls right now pretty much evenly balanced, but I suspect that this is a lie. It's just too close. I mean, how would you have the majority of polls coming out 1% either way or tied across multiple swing states? It's just beggars belief. I suspect what's really happening is that the pollsters are adjusting their polls until they come to this point. Remember, they're not just giving a random sample or giving you the raw data out there. They are adjusting the data for whatever models that they're using at the moment. And given their lack of success in 2016 and 2020 in basically predicting the support for Trump, like even though Trump lost in 2020, according to the polls before the event, he was supposed to lose by 8%. He lost by less than 1%. In 2016, he was supposed to lose by a significant margin, and he ended up winning. So these pollsters have obviously been burnt, and therefore they are more likely to kind of hedge their bets. That could be why we are seeing these really weird, kind of 1% either way. And one thing that can be said is this, that if you look at the aggregate of polls, you find that there is a trend over the last couple of weeks. That trend is towards Trump's favor. We are seeing, where Harris was leading by 3%, now she's leading by 1%. Where she was leading by 2%, she's now maybe tied. There's even a couple of polls out there that have Trump as the leader in the general election, the overall, election, even though the swing states still remain very, close. Then moving on to China, we had news of China stimulus coming out. We're talking about $1.5 trillion or so, something like that, of stimulus. That's roughly 8% of the GDP of China, which is a large amount of money. But if you consider just some of the measures he's done in the past, like back in 2008, he did about 30% of the GDP of the country, which, obviously in relative terms is bigger, but in absolute terms, this is probably the biggest, stimulus they've ever done. Something to note about here, the market was disappointed. Why? Because basically, a lot of this stuff is going towards things like bailing out, local governments that have issues with unused land, etc., useless buildings and so on. The Chinese problem at the moment is not so much a capacity to improve, it's the direction at the top. And one example I want to put forward to you guys as to just how out of touch the Chinese government is in terms of its view of the world. Xi Jinping announced as the president of China, announced a plan, Powerhouse 2035, where he wants to boost Chinese culture, which kind of makes sense here. I mean, for a country as powerful and big as China, it's remarkable how little, people, experience their culture. I mean, South Korea probably has a bigger cultural impact globally than China does, even though it's a tiny country in comparison, tiny GDP, etc. I mean, everyone knows, BTS, etc. They've watched the Squid Games. I doubt any of you guys could identify the 4 classics of China. It was Outlaws of the Marsh or The Journey to the West, etc. Nobody knows about these things. This is effectively like Shakespeare to China, but we don't know these things. You don't know what the big Chinese blockbusters of the last couple of years have been. But in terms of economic power, they've been very powerful. So Xi Jinping has come out and said, we want to make our cultural power as strong as our economic power. And how does he want to do it? By basing it on Marxist principles. Come on. How out of touch are you with the world that you think that trying to promote China's cultural impact to the world would be boosted by basing it on Marxist principles? So that just shows the issues that we're having in China at the moment. And then we had some economic numbers from the US. Long story short, we had inflation a little bit high. We had growth, GDP growth, a little bit below expectations. And then we had some jobs numbers, the ADP jobs numbers well above expectations, and the revision also above expectations. Now, what this all comes down to is that I think that if you had to make a guess, say what the market's predicting, forecasting for the next year or so in terms of rate cuts, I would probably, if you had to bet over or under that, I'd bet under. I'd bet there'd be fewer rate cuts than the market's anticipating for the next year or so. Why? Because it seems that the overall economy is not really going towards, the target for inflation as quickly as we would want, and employment remains reasonably strong. Both those factors does not argue for very big, very strong rate cuts. And so I suspect a few more numbers like this here and expectations around rate cuts would probably change towards, fewer cuts. So let's move on to the tech numbers. So we had some releases this week. We saw, Microsoft, we saw Meta, we saw Alphabet release results, Amazon as well. So let's just look at a couple of them. So the Microsoft Meta results were good, but they were not great in terms of their forecasts, especially in terms of spending. Meta is talking about a lot of spending in terms of AI, and Microsoft is not far behind. In fact, I've mentioned this in the past. Microsoft alone, if you look at the AI spending that it's doing over the next year or so, in terms of comparing it to other infrastructure spendings that have happened in the past, it's pretty much the biggest that there's been. It's bigger than what the US is spending per year in inflation-adjusted terms to get to the moon. It's bigger than what they spent to build the national highway system on a yearly basis. This is up there. This is one of the biggest infrastructure expenditures in history. If not the largest ever. And it's being done by a private company, and it's being done focused on AI. And like I said, also we're seeing Meta doing the similar kind of massive spending. We also had news that XAI by Elon Musk is looking to get a valuation of about 40 billion, just to show like the kind of numbers people talk about sometimes Twitter, and Twitter's like, he lost 20 or 30 billion dollars on Twitter. He just created a company out of nothing that's currently worth 40 billion probably by market valuation. And he did it in the last, I would say, less than a year. So big money is going towards AI. Unfortunately, we haven't seen some of the results like really push through. And then another company that released results this week was Alphabet, Google's parent company. And I want to focus here a little more detail. Now, Alphabet is facing a court case by the US government about its monopoly practices, and it's lost that. And so now they're looking at the remedy. What's the fix? What's the punishment? What's the solution to the problem that we see in terms of Google's or Alphabet's monopoly? And there's two ways to go about this. There's going to be either an agreement that they behave in a certain way, or a breakup of the company. If a company is too big, it's a monopoly, you break it into smaller pieces. As a shareholder, and we are a shareholder because my AI portfolio does have Alphabet, as a very large component of that portfolio, I would much rather prefer a breakup than a agreement. Why? If you look at agreements, the last big agreement like this we've ever had would be Microsoft back in the day, and then that pretty much coincided with Steve Ballmer's reign at Microsoft. Now, maybe Steve Ballmer isn't a great CEO because when he's left, Satya Nadella has had a huge outperformance in the stock market. While he was in charge for over a decade, like I said, the stock was down like 8% over that period of time. So, like I said, could be partially due to the fact that he was a very bad manager. Could also be due to the fact that he's dealing with a situation that was hard to the company. If we do see a similar situation with Google, Alphabet, we could see maybe a lost decade. This is not the right decade to be lost. There's so many different things happening in the tech space that to lose a decade right now would be maybe unrecoverable. A breakup, on the other hand, what it would do is would separate Google into various different parts, and which might actually be better, not just for shareholders, but for Google and those individual companies as well. Just to go through like Google's components and what they might be worth. Okay, the search business is pretty much the big cash cow at Google at the moment. Combined with the advertising business. The search and advertising, that combination, really powerful business, and probably accounts for the majority of the value of Google right now, which is just over $2 trillion. But if you look at the other components, let's look at them. Waymo. Waymo is a self-driving taxi company, kind of like what Tesla is trying to do, Waymo is already doing. That is actually driving people in cities in the US currently. Now, if you had to list that as a separate company, you could argue it worth a few billion. But if you look at Tesla's valuation, you could argue it could be worth several tens of billions, maybe even more than that. That technology, properly instituted out in the world, would not be a rival to Tesla. It could be a rival to Uber, a $200 billion company. Okay, so potentially this is at least a tens of billions dollar company. It could be a hundreds of billions dollar company if they could get their listed separately. It's Uber, but better because it's Uber without having to worry about paying your drivers. Then let's look at YouTube. YouTube is probably making about 60 billion in terms of revenue per year. If you include the subscriptions and the advertising, I say probably because some of the stuff is hidden. They don't give you the full details. A $60 billion company, what kind of P ratio are you going to put into that? If you took a revenue to its price ratio, you put into that. And the great thing about YouTube is that it's like Netflix, but better. What do I mean by that? Firstly, it's like Netflix, except it has more viewers. It's like Netflix, except it doesn't have to pay in advance for content. It doesn't have to risk its content. People just go make their own stuff on YouTube at any point in time. It's like I said, it's like YouTube, but better. Its subscription business, it's growing quite well. Its advertising business, it's massive. Its ability to basically retain eyeballs significantly more than Netflix is. Netflix is a $300+ billion company, and YouTube is a better company. You could easily argue its valuation should be at least as high as Netflix, possibly more. $300-400 billion, whatever you want to count that for YouTube. What else is there? Well, there's also Isomorphic Labs, which is basically a part of DeepByte. So let's just look at DeepByte/Isomorphic Labs and see what that might be worth. Well, DeepByte are the people that developed the initial technology that OpenAI is using to create its LLMs. OpenAI is valued $150 billion. DeepByte could be worth at least as much, and I would argue possibly more, because they have things that OpenAI does not have. They have things like the Isomorphic Lab, which is based on one of its models, which is the AlphaFold model, which allows people to basically test the shape of proteins, by using a computer, as opposed to going through a long, laborious process. This allows drug companies to make drugs that are much more suited to individual diseases, much less likely to have side effects, etc. What is that worth? Then there is also things like Nobe, which is basically a model that basically lists a whole bunch of, or gives the ability to discover a whole bunch of stable materials. In fact, by some measures, 10 times more materials are possible with Nobe than humans have discovered in the entire history of humanity. What is that worth? And not to exclude the fact that we do still have the LLMs. We still do have the generative, AI models, and they will probably be more powerful, because one of the reasons that Gemini is so widely panned is because the fact that Google's leadership, Alphabet's leadership, had to include a bunch of DEI stuff that do stupid things like draw, for instance, Asian female Nazis and that kind of stuff. Without that overarching supervision by Google, that might not be a problem anymore. So like I said, maybe 150, maybe a $200 billion company on its own, maybe more than that. And then there's the advertising business as well. That thing is probably the world's premier advertising business. And then Android, even something like Android, you would say to yourself, oh, but Android's for free. Well, how would they make money off it? Well, just look at how Apple gets paid $20 billion to have Google as its basically default search engine. You think Microsoft wouldn't want to pay $20 billion to have Bing as the default search engine in Android phones? I think that's a pretty good bet they would. What is that worth in terms of revenue? Because it's almost free revenue, $20 billion a year. How would you value that? Well, I would say at least over $100 billion. And so you have all these components, some of them worth hundreds of billions of dollars, that are currently a part of Alphabet and probably not properly valued as a part of Alphabet. And if you do have a split up, you could probably see a huge uptick in valuation, overvaluation. However, like I said, if you don't see a split up and you have that degree occur, you could see Google/Alphabet missing out on one of the most pivotal points in tech history. That's it for this week. I look forward to speaking to you guys in next week, where we hopefully should know when who the US president is going to be. But I doubt it. I think there still might be doubts about who the president is, even in the next time we speak. Okay, cheers, guys.